everyone, and welcome to the LGBTQIA plus History Club. My name is Amy Jeffrey, and I'm a volunteer on the LGBTQIA plus Heritage Project. So the whole idea behind this series is looking at sort of LGBTQIA plus history and uncovering sort of lesser known stories of this community. To this end, we have a very exciting speaker tonight. We have Dr. Maurice J. Casey, and Dr. Morris is an Irish. Dr. Maurice Casey is an Irish historian based in Belfast, where he was a research fellow at Queen's University. He grew up in the Tipperary town of Cahir. Am I saying that correctly?
Yep, Cahir or Care. Yep.
Oh, Care. And studied English and history at Trinity College Dublin for receiving an MPhil in Modern European History from Cambridge University. In 2020, he completed his doctoral research at Oxford University, where his project examined Irish women and radical internationalism 1916 to 1939. His work bridges different fields, including the history of interwar radicalism, Irish history, queer history, and the social history of ideas. And he has recently published his first book, Hotel Lux, and this will be released. Well,
Or was released
it is
last year.
released.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm reading your old website. It's just came out, and I believe that Sally Rooney has endorsed the book. So
Yep.
there's some very high praise indeed. So I feel like you can't get better praise than that. So we're very excited to hear your talk tonight, which is called Elisa and Joyce, Uncovering a Revolutionary Love Story. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Amy, and thanks to Joe and everyone on the project as well for having me along this evening. So I'm going to share a story that took me a number of years to research. Some of you on this call I've met before through my work for the Queer Northern Ireland project based at Belfast. This is not a Belfast or a Northern Irish story, but it is an Irish story. And it's one of the stories that features in my book, which Amy mentioned, which came out in August last year, Hotel Lux. And that book began life as my PhD thesis. And it took me 7 years to research it in full, 25 different archives in the US, in Ireland, in Russia as well, before the war back in 2018. And yeah, it's been wonderful. It's gotten a lot of readers, which has been great. And that's my first of two plugs that the book is available. You can find copies in No Alibis, in Waterstones, and wherever you get your books. So in this talk, I wanted to focus on one story from the book, the main queer history from the book, which is the love story between these two women photographed here. On the left is Elisa de Jager, born in 1925. And on the right is Joyce Rathbone, who was born in 1929. And they're photographed here around 1962. I'm sure people will recognize the location of the photograph. It's on O'Connell Bridge in the centre of Dublin. There used to be a photographer there, Arthur Fields, who used to take pictures of people passing by, and he would sell you the picture that he took. So this was clearly a photograph that they got strolling through Dublin arm in arm. To all intents and purposes, any onlookers, just two close friends, but with the sort of magic of historical research in hindsight, we can discover something more. I myself found this photograph in the late summer of 2021, and I found it in a shed on the northern coast of Spain. So really, the story of my talk is going to be the story of what led me to this, finding not only this relationship, but this photograph and the archive of this relationship. But the story begins far from this Dublin street and far from 1962, really with the beginning of my PhD in 2016. That's just an image of a much fresher faced me. That was my office in Oxford, or not my office, that was my room, also my office in Oxford, where I started my PhD. My PhD topic, I had written and worked on Irish queer history before starting my PhD topic, but I didn't intend for my PhD to be a queer history PhD. The topic was Irish women and international communism. I imagined I would find queer aspects in that research, but it wasn't the central thread of what I was researching. One of the early things that I came across in my research for my PhD was a reference to an Irish woman who had lived in Moscow in the 1920s, and it was a reference kept within this book. It was written about in this book, An American Testament by Joseph Freeman, who is this writer photographed here on the right. He was born in Ukraine. He left at the age of 7 and his family moved to America, and he grew up in Brooklyn. And in 1926, he emigrated to Moscow, where he spent a year working as a translator in the headquarters of the International Communist Movement. And in his memoir, he talked about how his mentor and his boss when he was in Moscow was an Irish woman who he called OB in the book. And so this Irish woman was essentially a kind of a historical mystery. She had only been mentioned a few times in a few paragraphs in the book. And I set out in the first few weeks of my PhD to try and crack his pseudonym to figure out who this OB was. So I went down a few trails, one dead end, but then I went at a different angle. So I read more into the book, and I saw that Joseph Freeman had mentioned how this woman, this Irish woman, had a really close friendship with another woman in the hotel, who was the ex-wife of a Methodist minister from the US. So then I started narrowing down ex-wives of Methodist ministers who lived in 1920s Moscow, and that helped me narrow in my focus to a woman called Ruth Kennel, whose archive ended up in the University of Oregon in the West Coast US. So I got in touch with this archive in Oregon, and I had a look through the catalog of archival material, and there was a set of correspondence in the material by a woman called May O'Callaghan. And I figured that might be the Irish woman I'm looking for, purely based on the intuition and judging by the name and it being an Irish name. So I wrote to the archive and I said, I'd like to request scans of this correspondence by this woman, May O'Callaghan. So they charged me $160 for the scans, which was a lot to spend on what was just like kind of a punt, but it ended up paying off enormously. It cost so much because the correspondence was so wide ranging. These were letters sent by this one Irish woman to her American friend from 1923 to 1970. And this is one letter. And it gives you a little insight into who this woman was because it's written in Russian. So this Irish woman could speak Russian clearly. And it's also signed off. You see the bottom right of the letter, it says OC. So this was how I cracked this pseudonym. Joseph Freeman, in his book referring to this Irish woman, had referred to her as OB. In fact, all of her friends knew her as OC. So once I had this name of May O'Callaghan, I was able to learn more about her. I was able to do more research once I had positively identified her name. May was born in Wexford town, pictured here, in 1881, into a middle-class Catholic family. Her father was a Royal Irish Constabulary constable, quite a high-ranking police figure in the area in Wexford. Her family clearly valued third-level education, she was one of 4 children, a boy, one surviving boy, and 3 girls. Her eldest sister studied university. Her middle sister became a nun. And May followed her elder sister to Vienna. Her eldest sister married an Austrian businessman. And May, in her early adulthood, moved to Vienna, where she studied at the University of Vienna, learning French and German, in which she was fluent. And eventually, being hired by her brother-in-law's shipping company to promote his shipping business in the US. So she traveled from Vienna to the US via London in 1914, and the First World War broke out while she was in London. Seeking a means of keeping afloat, she applied for a sub-editor role that she saw advertised in a newspaper. A recently launched feminist newspaper, the Women's Dreadnought, was looking for a sub-editor. So the advert was placed by the suffragette Sylvia Pankhurst, pictured here, in East London. So that was how May O'Callaghan, this Irish woman, became the sub-editor of the Women's Dreadnought, later called the Workers' Dreadnought, which was a left-wing feminist newspaper, published mainly for an East London audience, but which circulated across Britain, even across Europe and within Ireland as well. Within the offices of the Dreadnought, she made a friendship with two sisters that would become very important to her life and to the story I'm going to tell this evening. That's a picture of a younger May O'Callaghan on the left, and then the two women on the right. In the center, you have Nellie Cohen and her younger sister Rose Cohen. They were born both in Whitechapel in East London. Their parents had come over from Poland. They were part of the wider wave of 1880s Jewish emigration from the Russian Empire into East London, where you had this Jewish emigration that settled alongside an earlier famine era Irish migration. So May's world in East London, where she remained from 1914 and through to the end of the First World War and then on into the 1920s, was a very cosmopolitan world. It was a very radical world. And May and her two friends, the Cohen sisters, were on the peripheries of the early foundations of the British Communist Party. And once the Communist Party was established, it was established in response to kind of a wider movement by the Bolsheviks after they had seized power in 1917, to set up communist parties across the world modeled on their example, all of which would be coordinated from hubs in Moscow and Petrograd by an organization called the Communist International, in short form, the Comintern. And the Comintern was there was a vast bureaucracy that was tasked with information gathering. It was tasked with even clandestine activity like moving arms to revolutionary parties. But there's a simple fact of any major organization, whether it's involved in overthrowing the world order or solidifying the liberal world order, is that it requires administrative staff. And this is what brought May O'Callaghan and as well her two friends, the Cohen sisters, to Moscow. So this is May O'Callaghan's entry questionnaire, which I accessed when I went over to the Moscow archives in 2018. You can see there, that's what the name O'Callaghan looks like in Cyrillic, the OK. And so she became part of this huge workforce. You can see here, these are the kind of congresses that she would have worked at. If you look at this one, there's quite a famous picture of the Second Comintern Congress. And if we look at it in terms of the gender dynamics, right, you see here the men kind of up on the podium, but then when you look beneath that podium, you zoom in and you see the table here of stenographers. So the people taking the shorthand notes of the speeches. You can see these were all women. It was it was a disproportionately female workforce, the administrative work in the Comintern. Why is that? Because the gendered nature of education meant that women were more likely to be trained in secretarial skills like stenography and typing. For example, May O'Callaghan. Not only did she speak all the major languages of the Comintern, French, German, English, and Russian, but she was also an accomplished typist and someone who could work with shorthand. So in Moscow, she rises quite rapidly and eventually becomes the head of English translation work in the HQ of the Comintern in the press section. And while she was there, she lived in this famous hotel, the Hotel Lux, which became the hotel, which is the title of my book. And the Hotel Lux was established in 1913 before the revolution. The Bolsheviks seized it after the revolution and turned it into the dormitory for visiting revolutionaries and technical staff coming from across the world. So it became this really interesting and vibrant crossroads of radical activity. A young Ho Chi Minh lived in the hotel at the same time as Mayo Callahan. Tito of Yugoslavia as well was in the hotel at the same time. So major figures of the 20th century moved through it. Here's just a little kind of illustrated cross section of the hotel, and it was very important in terms of how May experienced it, how she navigated the hotel. You had a wing at the back, which is where some of her younger friends lived. She lived at the front in a room that overlooked the street out below. And it was in the canteen of the hotel, Gastronome Adin, where she made a friendship that would be extremely important for the rest of her life. That was her friendship with this woman here, Emmy Leonhard, who lived in room 14, which I believe was on the same corridor as May, as the one that May lived on. And Emmy was from a wealthy Hamburg banking family. She had turned her back on that family wealth, and she had dedicated herself to the revolutionary cause in 1918, eventually joining the German Communist Party. When she arrived the Hotel Lux in 1925, she was pregnant with her first child. The father of that child was a married man, not married to Emmy, Edo Fimen, who was at that point one of the most famous, one of the most well-known European trade unionists. He was the head of the International Transport Workers Federation, the largest global transport workers federation. So a particular moment happened in the hotel which bonded May and Emmy together with the daughter that she had in the hotel. So in late May, in fact, almost exactly a century ago today, Emmy, pictured here, went into labor in the hotel, and she called on her Irish friend May. And May arranged for the taxi to bring Emmy to the hospital, the Kremlin hospital. May paid for Emmy's care. She also covered the taxi fare. And this is where Emmy, on May 30th, 1925, gave birth to her first daughter, Elisa. So, if you remember the title of my talk, you may have been wondering, what is this guy doing, bringing us all the way back to 1920s Moscow? Well, here we have one of our duo. We have little Elisa as a 1-year-old, gurgling and crawling around the Hotel Lux in Moscow. So while Elisa was being looked after by a nanny in the hotel, what was her mother and her friends up to? Well, they worked as translators, largely, working both within the Comintern headquarters building, but also within the Kremlin Palace. This was the period between Lenin's death and Stalin's firm cementing of his power, a time of debate over who would lead the future of the revolution. And so this is how I kind of surmise one of the kind of more remarkable findings of my research, that in these final face-to-face showdowns between Stalin and Trotsky, the woman heading the English language translation team was a middle-aged woman from rural Wexford. So life, although was very technical, was also quite exciting, and the excitement came from the space that they were in. So you find here a quote that I think surmises it well. This is May's friend Ruth, the American woman, writing to her mother in 1925. She talks about how it seems incongruous to enter this place and see a score of men and women busily at work, a staff of men and women from every country of the world, many of them from the prisons of those countries, and the majority of them having known persecution and poverty in the old world. And here we talk in many languages with a feeling of perfect security, what a paradise Moscow is for the rebels and outcasts of the capitalist world. So Moscow at this time in the 1920s was a place where radicals, those who were radical revolutionary socialists, communists, could go and live in a space where they were no longer the pursued, but felt themselves to be the active creators of this new world. And it was also a world where people who had distant identities of other kinds also found themselves ending up. And you see an interesting current of discussion around sexuality that courses through May's world in 1920s in Moscow. And indeed, May's own close friendships with women did not go unnoticed by those around her. Ruth, again, in a handwritten note that I found shoved between pages of her unpublished autobiography when I went over to the University of Oregon, wrote that while I was never able to forget that May O'Callaghan was another woman and hence not quite as thrilling as a man would have been, some of the happiest hours of my life have been spent in her company. And yet, so rare a thing from the viewpoint of man is friendship between women that whispers reached our ears from the comrades about the nature of this friendship. Suggestions which shocked and disgusted me, since I was still rather ignorant of the intricacies of such matters, more familiar phenomena to a European. So here she is talking about the rumors that circulated that May and Ruth were in a relationship. While Ruth had a number of affairs with men, regular affairs with many different men in May's friendship circle, May, as far as I've seen in the material that I've looked at, never had a romantic relationship that she openly wrote about with a man or a woman. However, after reading James Joyce's Ulysses in 1927 and having a friend confide to her that he had slept with three different married women over a 24-hour period, she was sent into a moment of sexual introspection. And she wrote her friend Joseph a letter in a Joycean stream of consciousness in which she looked internally at her own sexuality. And so I'll quote from a bit of that letter that she composed. May wrote, I suppose I've not read Adler for nothing. Adler being a figure of psychoanalyst in the early 20th century who talked about sexuality and repression. I wonder, does Joseph think I can be? Probably possible. The world is mad and people and feelings, why can't I be natural? This absurd shyness where I love. Also an inheritance. My mother never showed her feelings to us kids. All these damned complexes are Irish of our type. These Russian boys think being Irish so wonderful, etc., and the pain of longing and regret we all have. Rot. Is it possible to F as he did these last days? In the early days, I wanted it every day, but always the same one. Makes a difference. That Sunday business, it was that Sen woman. Of course, it might have been the French, but what matter? I wish I'd asked, was she willing? And I think that final line, suggestive, it's turned towards the feminine pronoun, but also when we think about it in the wider context of the letter itself. One person who was Irish, but was certainly not uh, certainly did not have a shyness where he loved was Liam O'Flaherty, who's a name that might be familiar to some of you from your school curriculums. Liam O'Flaherty, the Aran Islands born writer who in the 1920s was at the peak of his literary fame. He's recently experienced this minor rediscovery spearheaded by the podcaster and artist Blind Boy Boat Club of the Rubber Bandits. But in the 1920s, he was a name on every literary figure's lips, and also a rather infamous figure in London literary circles for his womanizing tendencies. May O'Callaghan was a huge admirer of his writings and played an important role in introducing Liam O'Flaherty to Soviet audiences, so she was instrumental in his work being translated into the Russian language. In 1927, May left Moscow behind for the first time in a while, and she returned to Ireland. So she wrote these letters to her friend Joseph in September of 1927. This is one that was sent on the back of some Dublin postcards. She talked about meeting Liam O'Flaherty and how they got on so well. They got on like a house on fire. She found him a kind of full of devilment. And so May then returned from that trip to Dublin. She was full of plans and projects. She had been commissioned by the Moscow State Publishing House to write a guide to Ireland for Soviet audiences. And she was really integrating herself into the elite Soviet cultural set. So in the diary of Alfred H. Barr, the man who founded the New York Museum of Modern Art, he visited Moscow in that time, and he wrote in his diary of this extraordinary Irish woman who showed him behind the scenes of all the most fascinating cultural venues. So May, in early 1928, was enjoying her life in Moscow, felt that she was on a inexorable rise to a position of prominence within the cultural world, yet unaware of the storm that was brewing behind her through an introduction that she made between her new friend, Liam O'Flaherty, the Irish writer, to her old friend from the suffrage days, Nellie Cohen, of the two Cohen sisters. Later in 1928, May returned from Moscow. This time she went to London, and she learned of the outcome of that introduction between Nellie and Liam O'Flaherty. So you can see here May O'Callaghan's signature writing style. She writes, "Now, I know you have a charming habit of forgetting that things are told you in confidence. This is not meant nastily, but now I want to tell you someone else's secret, and therefore must ask you to be specially careful. So far, I am the only person who knows. Nellie, like a sweet, inexperienced person, has slipped and put her foot in it seriously. Result is that she thought it would be nice to go to Russia, where children are not considered illegitimate. Have you got me? She had already talked of getting away from this country for a year or so, but now she must. Well, I am the friend in need, and I do not want her to think that she's hampering my movement in any way, as the circumstances are all rather peculiar, and I want to think I am in a way an expectant mother by proxy, as it might have been mine." So May here made a number of interesting references, one to the fact that at that time, in the early 20th century, in 1919, the Soviet Union removed the legal category of illegitimacy from all children born outside of marriage. It was at that point the only country that in Europe that did not have that stigma that existing legally. Of course, socially it was a different story, but at least legally, children born outside of marriage were not prejudiced in any way from children born within marriage. So that's part of the appeal of May bringing Nellie to Moscow when she's pregnant. But for reasons and stories of intrigue that I go into in the book, May was refused a re-entry visa to Moscow. So instead, she turned westwards. She decided if I could not go back to the Hotel Lux, that she would go to a world that at least retained some of the social mores of the Hotel Lux. And that was New York, because she had a circle of friends who had lived with her in the hotel who had returned to New York. So May and Nellie May and Nellie moved to New York in 1928, and this is where, in February 1929, Nellie, pictured here on the right, gives birth to her daughter Joyce. And then on the left here, you have May with Joyce as well in New York. So you can see our puzzle pieces have slotted together. We have these two characters, Elisa and Joyce. But right now, they're babies living very different lives. Elisa spent her early years in Germany. Her mother was very active in revolutionary politics. Her father was very active in creating wider European anti-fascist networks. They had to flee in 1933. They had to hop country quite regularly. Whereas Joyce grew up initially in New York and then in London. So remember when I first found the letters from May to Ruth, they were really long. They went from 1920s to 1970. So I was able to use those letters to track this child, Joyce, growing up, to hear year by year in May's updates who this child, who she became. She became, I learned from the letters, a piano teacher in London, a well-regarded piano teacher. And then I found her name, Joyce Rathbone. She eventually took the name of her adoptive father, Hugo Rathbone, who had also lived in the Hotel Lux, but that's another story. And using Joyce's name, I then accessed her will, which are public record in the UK, and I saw where all her material had been bequeathed to a woman called Pippa, who, as it turned out, lived only a short bus ride away from where I was doing my PhD in Oxford. So I spoke to Pippa, told her about this whole story of Mayo Callahan and how I was interested in her. And she said, I've never heard of Mayo Callahan, but you're welcome to look through documents that I have. So I went to Pippa's house, and immediately my eyes were drawn to her bookshelf, and she had all these books by Liam O'Flaherty, which she had inherited from Joyce. And when I opened one of them, I saw that it was inscribed from Nellie to Mayo Callahan, with love and good wishes from Nellie and Joyce. So that really got me excited. And I said to Pippa, Pippa brought out some boxes of material, which is really interesting material. And not long before I was leaving, she told me that there's another box in the attic of material. She doesn't know if it will be of relevance. It's a large box, and that I would be welcome to have a look at it in more detail next time. But I said, okay, I'll take a look at it now, and then I can figure out whether it's worth my while coming back here again. So she said, yeah, she told me the story of this other box that was in the attic. She said, it's a series of it's a big box of love letters, and the love letters sent to Joyce. And Pippa told me she was going to throw them away, but then she thought these are all quite touching and they're quite meaningful, so she couldn't bring herself to kind of declutter them. So I went into the attic, and I looked at these boxes of love letters, which is really enormous, thousands. I haven't even been able to count how many there are, and all preserved chronologically. So they go from 1962 to 1990, and immediately, of course, my eye was drawn to the sign off, Elisa. And so I knew exactly who this was. Pippa did not know the context here, but I was truly blown away by this. So to remind you then, just to kind of put all these pieces together, we begin with May, this woman in the hotel in Moscow. In 1925, she brings her friend Emmy to the Kremlin Hospital, where she gives birth to her daughter Elisa. And then in 1928, May leaves Moscow behind. And in 1929, she's present when her friend Nellie's daughter, Joyce, is born. And these two women, Elisa and Joyce, grew up in two different families, two different worlds. But eventually, in the 1960s, get back in touch or meet through this woman, Mayo Callahan. They're introduced by Mayo Callahan, and they fall in love. So I have, the box of love letters is literally here in my study here in Belfast, and then I have a folder of some of them here. I'd be happy to read from some of them if anyone would be interested afterwards. There's I read through them. I mean, Joyce and Elisa never actually lived in the same place. Elisa always lived in either Switzerland. She was a UN worker. Eventually posted to the UN mission in Jerusalem, and Elisa and Joyce always lived in London, which was difficult for them but useful for me because it was always long distance. Therefore, there was always letters. And I discovered Elisa's love letters to Joyce in 2017. But something I always had in the back of my mind that I need to, for no other reason than just to kind of put a full stop to the story, I need to know what became of the other side of the correspondence, so Joyce's letters to Elisa. In 1970, in Elisa's letters to Joyce, I saw that Elisa had a nephew born into her life, a young boy called Peter. And that got me excited again. I thought, well, this guy was born in 1970, high chance that he's still knocking around somewhere. And so I just set out to find him. So I tried and tried and tried. At one point, I did a blog post where I mentioned everyone's names loads of times, just in case this Peter figure started searching his own family history and then found me. I didn't I didn't hear from Peter. I heard from a man in Frankfurt called Rene, and Rene sent me this picture, and this actually shows a young Elisa there on the right with her little sister Alida. He told me the story of this photo, how his father had been smuggled out of Nazi Germany by Elisa's mother Emmy, and how as they were escaping Nazi Germany, she had torn this photograph in half. She had kept one half and he had kept the other. And the idea was that they would flash it at each other as a silent signal of danger. So this was really interesting and very moving. And I asked Rene if he knew anything of what became of the family after the 1970s, after Emmy died. I knew that she died in 1976. And he said no, that he'd never been in touch with them, but that he'd always wanted to find out more, and was so delighted to find my blog post. Then this was all happening around 2017, 2018. I found this biography of the first woman president of Switzerland, Ruth Dreyfus. And in the acknowledgement section of the biography, the author had noted that she thanked Alida, Peter's mother, for providing information for the biography. So I contacted the author. She said she couldn't help me, but that she'd be happy to put me in touch with the first woman president of Switzerland. So I emailed the first woman president of Switzerland. And then she told me that she hadn't heard from Peter in many years, but as she knew him, he was going by Pedro, as he was living in Spain. And so she gave me also the village where she had known of him to be living in Spain. And so I put up a tweet asking, did I know anyone with a connection to this village? And within 24 hours, someone had connected me with the local mayor. So I then messaged Pedro. This is me and Pedro. We eventually met in 2021. I messaged him in late 2019. In January of 2020, we made lots of plans that we'd meet up in April of that year. Of course, then we did not meet up in April of 2020, but eventually in the summer of 2021, we did get to meet up. And this is just outside his home, where I was able to do my research in this really amazing part of the world. And there was just a huge, enormous amount of material. And after 3 days, Pedro emerged with a black bin bag of letters, and he said that he had found them. It's a really moving moment because he showed me the letters. So I had the letters from Joyce to Lisa. So now we had the love letters going in both directions. My book doesn't tell the full story of Elisa and Joyce's relationship because it's really tied to the chronology of their parents' generation. I do leave them in the eyes of how their parents would have seen them and how their parents understood the relationship between them. And what I've discovered, and has even been affirmed more by new material that has come to light, is how these women, you see an elderly Emmy here on the left, you see an elderly who is Elisa's mother, you see May here in the middle, who is mother to neither Elisa nor Joyce, but was instrumental in both of them being born in an unusual way. And then Nellie here on the right, who was Joyce's mother. All three of these women accepted this relationship, and not only accepted it, but really treated their respective partner as a daughter-in-law. When May died in 1973, Emmy wrote a letter to Nellie talking about how meaningful her friendship with May O'Callaghan throughout her life had been. And she ends with this paragraph, which I really love, where Emmy wrote, "I cannot tell you how thankful I am that you cared for her during her last days, and how happy I am that we know each other, and that the next generation, Joyce and Elisa, have become such good friends, so that OC will ever be for us, as long as we live, a living presence." And I think that there's something very beautiful about that idea of seeing this relationship as a kind of a living legacy of May O'Callaghan, as she had introduced them. So this is just more material has been coming to light since, and this is some letters that were sent to Rose Cohen, Nellie's younger sister, in the Hotel Lux in Moscow, which were recently unearthed in Amersham in North London. So you never know what you're going to find in an attic. And yeah, so that's the story I wanted to tell. This is the second of my two plugs. If you want to hear the full story of the hotel and all the people who met there and the wider history as well of Elisa and Joyce's story, you can pick up a copy of my book, Hotel Lux. It's also available as an audiobook if you prefer listening, narrated by myself. If you want 12 and a half more hours of me in your ears, it's available wherever you get your audiobooks. So yeah, that's everything, and I'm really happy to answer any questions. So thanks, everyone.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Casey. So interesting. Um, so many different sort of interlocking facets and stories. So I'm very excited to read the book. Um, I have two questions, if nobody minds me beginning. Um, so May O'Callaghan living in London in the late 1920s.
Yeah.
Um, do you have any evidence that she would have been in the same sort of circles as Kate O'Brien, who was also living in London at that time and in those sort of bohemian, free thinking circles?
Mhm. No, she's no connection to Kate O'Brien. Her circles is a her circles. Well, so late 20s. She's in New York. She comes back to London then in 33. She's in London. She's in London really for the rest of her life, 33 to 73, working in a left wing bookstore from 33 onwards. Her main cultural set was this kind of New York radical bohemia and then the Moscow cultural circle. But yeah, no evidence of her link to Kate O'Brien. Her other Irish literary contact was James Joyce. May wrote the first Russian language essay on James Joyce and corresponded with him to write it. But other than that, yeah, our Irish links were very much in the early part of her life, not the later part.
Okay, great. This is not an academic question, but just out of interest, any ghosts in the hotel logs?
I think ghosts. That's an interesting question. I mean, it's a pretty it must become a pretty haunted place because the atmosphere of the hotel in the late 20s when May and her friends were there, when it's this experience of being involved in a societal project, and yes, the security state and the apparatus of repression is exists around them, but they're blind to it. That begins to penetrate the hotel really in the late 30s, to the point at which in the late 20s, the back part of the annex at the back, that was where all the kind of younger people were billeted in rooms together. In the late 30s, during the Stalinist terror, there were so many arrests of kind of breadwinners, you might say, that the annex became essentially a home for mothers and children whose husbands had been arrested and executed. So the hotel itself has the hotel is almost like a to paraphrase Marx, it's a spectre haunting the history of communism because it the 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 darkness of what became of that project gets played out in the corridors itself. I'm sure there was some spooky vibes there.
Hmm. Wow, that's so interesting. And is the hotel still intact? Is it still functioning as a hotel?
No. No. When I was there in 2018, it was just a construction site. The only thing that remained was the front wall of the hotel. Everything else had been demolished behind that. Um, it it was redeveloped even in the post-war period as well. So it pretty much after the 1940s, it didn't exist in the same way that it did in the 20s and the 30s. Yeah.
Okay. Hotels are so interesting, like as a sort of cultural site of memory. Like it's just
Yeah,
like
yeah.
there
And
is something
someone
really interesting about hotels.
Yeah, and someone in Galway, I did a talk in Galway, and he pointed out, he's like, "You're so lucky it was called Hotel Lux. Like, it's a good
Mm,
jazzy hotel name because the hotel across the road was the Hotel Bristol, and it would have been harder to write a book called Hotel Bristol about a hotel in Moscow. People would have been like,
yes.
I don't understand this."
Okay. Um, so does anyone have any questions for Dr. Casey about the hotel hacks?
Oh, someone just bought a copy of the book. I think that was Mary Ellen. Thanks so much.
Yeah, I'm sort of wondering, was the period at the beginning in Moscow when Mary was there maybe for the first 5 or 6 years, and
Mhm.
it's looked really cosmopolitan, sounded really cosmopolitan. Was it generally seen as a sort of cosmopolitan or bohemian place to be in the world?
Yeah, it was. It was seen as the kind of it was it was spoken of in the same sense as kind of Weimar Berlin as being at the forefront of modernity. It also was for a period that people didn't realize was a window in time, a safe, legally safe place for queer people in that they in 1919 the same legal reforms that bring in legal abortions and ease divorce and remove childhood illegitimacy also decriminalized sex between consensual sex between men. So um, for a period, it also had an expansive idea of freedom and cultural experimentation that also fed into to drawing outcasts of all kinds to Moscow.
Which is always really great and alluring. But it's weird the way, in your comparison to Weimar Germany, that both periods of time are followed by violence and repression as well.
Mm, mm,
Yeah, I wonder if that's a theme, you know, because I think also
yeah.
New York, quite an amazing place at one point, and then Paris was very LGBT friendly and very bohemian at one time as well.
Yeah, yeah. On my more optimistic days, I think the pattern of history is one step back and two steps forward, which is progress, albeit slow progress.
Yeah.
I hope that bears out.
Well, yeah, I hope it bears out for now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Well,
finding those letters between the two women, which are quite overt, shall we say, in their discussion of their relationship, was that like surprising to you as as a queer
Hmm.
as a history of queerness,
Mm, mm.
or um, is this something you sort of would have maybe anticipated? And I suppose like could you just talk a little bit more about like
Yeah,
doing research specifically on lesbians and
yeah,
kind of what your experience has been?
yeah. I didn't anticipate it, but I've tried to kind of think through a way in which it's explainable. On one level, it is extraordinary that these letters would survive in both directions. It's extraordinary that these two women would meet and that the circumstances of their coming together would be so historically legible, right? Normally, when people meet, you can't explain their romance in the broader context of the October Revolution. But in this case, they understood themselves that without the Russian Revolution, they never meet. Um, but I think that there's something interesting there about their separate family backgrounds enabling them to come to an awareness of their identities and their desires because they grow up in these radical families. The discussions about possibility are just very different to, I think, a conventional family upbringing at that time. I think that it enabled them to kind of find these frameworks of understanding. What's interesting, because you can get into quite granular detail in the letters, is that Joyce is Joyce is the person who uses terms like homosexuality. Joyce is the person who's kind of reading the literature, let's say, in the 60s and and talking about same sex desire, lesbian identity, these kind of things, and using it to refer back to herself. Elisa is more seems to kind of conceive of her relationship, seems to conceive of her sexuality as loving Joyce, and actually that carried through as well throughout her life. Joyce was the only kind of was the only love of her life. That's how her family also conceived of her relationship. They thought, they didn't think of her in terms of gay or lesbian. They just was like, well, Elisa's in love with Joyce. So there's two different contexts there, of Elisa as well, who's living with her mother. She lives with her mother until her mother dies in 1973, and Joyce, who's living an independent life in London, and in fact lived on the same road as one of the early London lesbian bars, the Chepstow. So yeah, Joyce being very proximate to that world, and Elisa being further away. But I think to come back to kind of the core of your question was, which is about my surprise at finding it. Yes, it was surprising, but also it wasn't just chance, because the family backgrounds not only ensured that these women had a path to understanding their own desires, or not that other people didn't, but at least it was more readily discoverable for them, but also that it meant that that kind of progressive atmosphere within the families had knock-on effects, whereby each generation or the two generations held on to the love letters when they inherited them and didn't think that they were something that should be discarded. So both Pedro and Pippa kept the letters because they knew that they meant something to the people that they'd known and loved.
Okay, great. It's just amazing. Like you find you know, obviously went looking for them, but you find these letters, and like it's just a part of queer history that would not have been known otherwise. It wasn't like you'd gone to an archive. You
Mm,
you
mm.
made the archive in a way.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah, because I didn't know until I went to Pippa's house. I was just following one Irish woman. And the most extraordinary part of the story for me was that I'd found this love child of the Irish writer Liam O'Flaherty. But then when I went to Pippa's house, that was the first time I discovered that she had been in a relationship with Elisa, who I knew about separately from the letters, but didn't realize that they came together.
Brilliant. Um, does anyone else have any questions? I feel like I could ask loads of questions, but I think
Mary
Mary
Ellen, I
Ellen
think, has
has
a
Mary Ellen has something to say.
Maurice, that was fascinating. And
thank you.
it was me that bought the book. Now it was just a Kindle for, but that's
Oh,
fine.
great. Yeah.
I kind of read my books these days. Saves putting
Mm.
the glasses on at night. Um, are you planning to do anything with the letters? Like, are you planning to write something about them, publish maybe another book?
Um, if there was an audience for it, I certainly would. What I've been doing recently is doing book events where I bring the letters along. I think I'd kind of like what I'd like to do is maybe do something like a kind of a an almost Richard O'Leary inspired one man show with the letters, and tell the story in a kind of a tactile way with all the material itself. I am working on a documentary that's going to be out at BBC Radio 4 in September, which is about Elisa and her little sister Alida. It's not about Elisa's later life with Joyce. It's about uh, Elisa and her little sister growing up on the refugee routes as the children of anti-Nazi resistance organizers. But maybe there might be a some scope to do something. Yeah, maybe not just a follow-up book, but I think that they're kind of conducive to other formats as well. Something to think about.
Yeah, I definitely think you should do something with them. Like, I think that it's too important archival material just to stay in your study.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
So in your book, um, have you got this is gonna sound like a not a very like non-academic question. It's like, are there pictures in your book? But what I mean is, do you
Yeah,
have
yeah.
pictures of these letters in your book? And if so, like who did you get the permission from? Was it just yeah, like
I
this
I
Pippa person or What was the sort of...
Yeah, I'm lucky that both Pippa and Pedro are, are both really happy for me to talk about the story and share the story and do, Pippa um literally just gave me the box of letters back in 2017 and uh just has been happy for me to kind of write and talk about them. Pedro likewise. So I in the book I have lots of photos. I quote from the letters. I don't include transcripts of them. Or I don't include pictures of them just because for accessibility reasons and so on, it's just better to put text on the page. I did try to do this is just like really in the weeds kind of publishing discussions, but Elisa used to draw these comic strips describing parts of her life. And I really wanted to have break the narrative at one point and just have the comic strip reproduced page by page. But then the publishers went to the like printers and the printers were like, well, yes, that's a great idea. It'll cost this much. And then my publisher was like, we're not doing the comic strip. So there are kind of barriers you run into when you do, and I think it's cool to do those kind of more experimental formats. I think that's where kind of like zines can also come in. And I think that there's interesting history zines, particularly queer history zines, which are kind of bring in a more of a collage of sources and text.
Brilliant. Great. Any final questions for...
Yeah, well, it's not really a question. It's just more a thing of how what you've presented sort of impacts. I'm just thinking in today's really sort of instant news and and social media and blah blah blah. It's really lovely to be sort of whisked into a totally different world, parts of which seem more civilized than the world today. And there's really something therapeutic in that as well. It's just
Thanks, Martin. Really appreciate this.
Yeah.
It's been a joy to share the story and it's been great, and that's why I'm very happy to do this, and it's nice to have kind of a small intimate gathering as well to share it because it's my favorite story to tell.
Yeah, great.
Wonderful. Thank you, Maurice. I'm just going to end the recording.